Yes, welcome, colleagues. I was tempted to say welcome, fellow South Africans, but that phrase has come to have a very sinister connotation in these times. So thank you very much for joining us in this webinar. Before I introduce you to our guest speaker, I want to give you a little background to our institutional research agenda and activities over the past decade or so. So we commenced our institutional research agenda in around 2009 when I first took up my position as Director of Teaching and Learning. And at that stage, we worked closely with a colleague and institutional research specialist, Professor Victor Borden from Indiana University. And in the years that followed, we had at least 2 cohorts of UKZN staff trained in the art of institutional research. Then in 2017-18, around there, that institutional research activity was abruptly terminated by a certain acting DVC who didn't see the value in it and subsequently pulled out all funding from it. However, thankfully, the Kresge Foundation, it's a US-based foundation, the education foundation, saw the value in what we were doing and invited us to apply for a grant, which we did and which we thankfully received, which has enabled us to resume our work. And I'm fully grateful to Jan Botha, Prof. Jan Botha, who joins us today to share his thoughts on institutional research. Now, many of you will know Jan as one of our preeminent institutional researchers in the country and abroad. He is a professor in the DSI NRF Center for Excellence for Scientometrics and STI Policy, and the Center for the Research on Evaluation, Science and Technology, CREST, which we're all very familiar with, based at Stellenbosch University. Jan has worked in various capacities as manager and administrator at Stellenbosch University, including as Senior Director for Institutional Research and Planning. He's also served on various national policy-making task teams hosted by the DHET and CHE. He is also past president of the South African Association for Institutional Research, SAA. He's the editor and co-author of the publication Institutional Research in South African Higher Education, Intersecting Contexts and Practices. Was published in 2016 by Sun Media. And then he has a forthcoming publication called Utilization of South African Research on Higher Education, also by Sun Media, and we are looking forward to that publication. If you need further information about Jan Botha and his work, please request the link to his Google Scholar profile from Loisa, who will provide it. So Jan, thank you very much for your generosity in sharing this time with us. We invite you to deliver your address for up to 50 minutes, maybe a little longer. And then we would like to invite Q&A and for the discussion. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you very much, Ravi, and good morning, colleagues, to all of you. I'm honored by this invitation and the opportunity to engage with colleagues at one of our esteemed South African universities with a very long tradition and an interesting history. Thank you, Luiso. Also, thank you very much, Luiso, for this invitation. You know, with the pandemic, we all sit in our little nests at home, and we work and work and work. And although we have lots of these talks, I do find that it's yeah, sometimes it is somewhat lonely, and also with the type of intensive research that we do in our research center. Sometimes it's only you sitting in your study. So I really welcome this opportunity to share some of our recent research results with you. So I will talk to for about an input about 40 minutes. I'll put my clock to warn me at 40 minutes, and then I'll try to wind down so that we have enough time for discussion. I must say, were it not for pandemic conditions, it would have been wonderful to be in person present. I've done quite a number of workshops at various universities, also in KwaZulu-Natal, and I'm a bit of the older generation. I enjoy talking directly and in person to people, but that's how it is, and this is what we can do now. So let's try to make best of it. I will share my screen. I have prepared slides. So let me just open it up and make sure you can all see it.
Yes, it's clear, Jan. You can see it.
Let enlarge it a little bit, and just a moment for my computer to get it going. There we are. Right. Okay.
Yeah. Jan,
Is
Jan, your presentation?
that all good?
No, it's disappeared for some reason.
It disappeared.
Was on, yes.
So it's bring your shared window to the front. So I'll just share it on the not the presentation mode.
Yeah,
is that you can see that now?
Yes,
right.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Right, colleagues, the topic, the utilization of institutional research. Now, what I will do in this session is three broad topics. Firstly, I will talk about the so-called knowledge society and higher education, knowledge and the function of knowledge in higher education, but that will be a very brief introduction. The bulk of what I will do is number two, a historical overview of how research on higher education developed. And I'll define that, research on higher education in a broader sense. And then a particular form of research on higher education is institutional research. So that's more specifically the topic for the day. And those two in the context, the overall question of how is it used. And then in number three, I'll share with you the results of a case study that we conducted at a number of universities in the Eastern Cape, using a particular model, productive interactions, to look specifically at examples of how institutional research and broader research on higher education has been used in three different institutions. So we will come to a very concrete example. I know Victor Borden very well, Ravi and colleagues. We've worked together quite a lot, and he told me that he knows you and he worked with you. So I also want to commend you what you're doing at UKZN to interact internationally and for the high level at which you conduct institutional research in your institution. So colleagues, firstly then on this issue of the use of research. Incidentally, I got this yesterday in my mailbox from Leslie Swartz. You'll see there at the bottom right, good colleague of mine. He's the editor at the moment of the South African Journal of Science and the panelists. And they're organizing a session on how do we know if and when science make a difference. And I'm just showing this, this is next week, as to illustrate that this is an ongoing concern. We all think, all right, we do a lot of research, we do a lot of institutional research, we're involved in the creation of science or scientific knowledge. What happens to it? Does it make a difference? Does it make an impact? How can we increase the impact? And of course, with the discussions and the development of vaccination, all of that, we're very, very aware of the role of science and understanding the pandemic, all of that. I think society in general is urgently engaging with these questions. How do we know if and when science make a difference? And when we talk of this phenomenon, the use of knowledge or science or research, there are quite a number of terms that are used in the literature. And there I have a list: knowledge utilization, and then you get evidence-based knowledge. And in the green block, I have there evidence-based decision making in higher education as a concrete form of evidence-based knowledge and how we use it. And you can see all the others: exchange, transfer, research uptake, research use, the societal or the social impact of research, mobilization, brokering, management, knowledge management. That was one of the fads at some point. You will recall everyone talked about management of knowledge and the use of knowledge in a broader sense, knowledge into action, and then just dissemination of knowledge. And with that, science communication and scientific communication, scholarly communication. So various terms that are used in this regard. And I'll come back to this topic of research utilization or knowledge utilization and share with you a few models, and then I'll give a concrete example. Just one final comment on the use of research, and more specifically applied to institutional research. This is a quote from Raisa Musa and Linda Murray, colleagues from Wits University. And I want to read that for you. Professional or support staff, that's typically people working in IR office or in teaching and learning office or whatever. So the support staff, and on the other hand, academic staff based in faculties, do not always consider each other's work with as much thoroughness as perhaps they should. On the one hand, one of the universities that they interviewed reported that documents produced by institutional researchers and academic planners are rarely interrogated and tend to be unaccepted uncritically by the academic structures. On the other hand, only a few institutional researchers mention that they consult academic publications as sources of information for IR. I must say that this comment served as the exigence, as the prompter for a lot of work that we've done since 2016. And it's also something that I've discussed with Vic Borden quite often, and with various other international scholars. We do a lot of work in IR, we put out reports, but we don't necessarily collaborate with academics, people in education faculty and others who do research on the university. So it cut both ways. And sometimes when you talk to academics, and I'm back now working full-time in an academic faculty, the academics live in a very different world. They don't talk to the practitioners, to the people in management, to the people in the support services. So there's this big gap, people working in silos. And that was one of the prompters for this research project that I'll share with you some results. Right, let me get into point 2, the 3 developments. The one is research on higher education in a broader sense. Secondly, research on higher institutional research, very specifically, and then thirdly, research uptake or research utilization as a third broad concept to discuss. Now, the first one is to address research on higher education in a broad sense, understood as all research, whether done in support services or in academia, focusing on the phenomenon of higher education. I don't use the term higher education research because people then can confuse it with all the research that we do, whether it's on water or food or political science or whatever. Typically, that can also be called higher education research. It's research done in higher education institutions. I'm not talking about all of that. I'm talking specifically about research which has as focus, as object, the phenomenon of higher education. And I will just, instead of a long historical overview, just two things. Who are the types of scholars doing research on higher education, and what themes are typically covered in this type of research? Now, this goes back to work of Ulrich Teichler and others in the early 90s. And I found that very interesting to see the broader picture. So at least 5 types of scholars, sometimes or all of their time, focus on research related to higher education. We find the discipline-based researchers, and we all have read papers of economists or political scientists or sociologists, and they sometimes on occasion, or some of them even focus their career on that, to study the university sector or the higher education sector or a specific university. For example, a historian may study the history of a specific institution. So that's typically a discipline-based. These people are economists, are in their own faculty, and some of them then focus on higher education. Second category are typically the educationalists. They are in a discipline that is devoted to higher education, and we have a number of that at different universities in South Africa, where there's a part of a faculty of education, and sometimes also the Center for Teaching and Learning, or the teaching and learning researchers sort of live in both worlds. They have full-time researchers, but they're also in support services. But that's full-time researchers focusing full-time on higher education. Then thirdly, we get the NGOs, and there are also a number of them in South Africa, researchers externally funded, and they're based in their own external research unit or institute, and they also focus on higher education research. And you mentioned the Kresge Foundation. They don't do research themselves, but they often fund these independent research institutes, or they fund research within a university. Now, the third one is more specifically what you referred to in the introduction, probably the applied higher education researchers, often called IR, institutional researchers. And I'm just, in terms of talking about these things, I make a distinction between the research on higher education scholars and the IR professionals. Not that scholarly work is not professional, but just to make the distinction, the professionals are the IR people working typically in the support offices, and they're responsible to collect the data, to manage, to interpret it, and to serve the data in a way that makes sense for the decision makers. And then finally, we all know you can get the reflective practitioners, for example, an executive manager or a senior academic manager, somebody who becomes a dean or a DVC, and say you have a a DVC who spent her whole career in some scientific field, biochemistry or whatever. And then when she becomes a DVC, she develops an interest in higher education and start publishing and reading about some aspect of higher education. And so politicians, civil servants, and so on. So I think that's a first important insight, that there are various types of scholars involved in research which has as object higher education. Now, the themes covered, and you can spend hours and hours, and there's a whole vast literature. What themes are covered in this research? And there's a list from a study of Tite, who looked at various journals and came up with this. Teaching and learning, course design, studies on the student experience, student health, all of that. Studies on quality, system policy, globalization, all of that. Institutional management, that's typically where you would also find the institutional researchers. Academic work, that's all the staff related issues, professoriate, academic career, gender issues in academia. And then finally, the whole area of the second big function of higher education, knowledge production, the nature of research and forms of knowledge and research management, all of that. So these themes came up from analysis of higher education journals. If you ask what themes are covered by researchers on higher education, you'll find these, but there are various ways to classify this. Now, moving on to this type of research in South Africa. I'm talking here of South African research on higher education. And the SAK colleagues, it's the South African Knowledge Base. Now that's a big knowledge base that we run here at CREST. As you know, all people affiliated to universities in South Africa, we qualify for subsidy under certain conditions in accredited journals and so on. So all the publications by people working for public universities who have submitted it for subsidy, all of that, we have a full database of that, the SAK, the South African Knowledge Base. And then within that, a subset of that would be the South African research on higher education, the things that I've been talking about. So the SAK covers all fields of studies, but the limitation, it's only people associated to South African public universities. As you know, the private universities, the little bit of research they do, they don't get subsidy. Now, what this illustrates is that in 2005, research focusing specific on higher education, there were only 308 publication outputs, authorships. Let me just quickly explain that. The difference between an authorship and a publication. A publication may have 5 co-authors. Each author is a separate authorship. So one publication may have 5 authorships. Now for this type of analysis, we work with authorships. And the relation between authorships and publications is about 1 to 1.2 something, thereabout. So on average, the number of authors in a publication would be 1.1. So it's because there are many publications that are co-authored. So here we're talking about authorships. And you see the increase in higher education research is from 300 up to 1,000. So it's more than almost, yeah, a little bit more than 3 times more. And I just put in the comparison, the gray line, that's all publications in the SAK. And you can see the increase compared to the rest of what's been doing in the universities in all fields of studies, is that it was slightly faster in higher education. On this side, we have the number of publications of authorships on higher education, and on this scale, we have the publications on all fields of studies. So what we see from this is a huge increase and a lively field of studies. Now, just in terms of gender and race, we see that the authorships in higher education is about 55% female, compared to the authorships in all fields of studies is about 33% female. So it's much more of a balance that we find in higher education research, or research on higher education, compared to all the other fields. And in terms of a transformation in racial or population terms, there you can see again the gray columns is all fields of study, up to 38% in 2015 of the authorships were people who are Black, inclusive, as I defined it there, whereas in higher education research, 46% are people who are Black, African, Indian, colored, in terms of the old South African categories. So we see that the field of research on higher education is more successful thus far in terms of transformation compared to all the other fields. Then final comment about research on higher education in general. Where do people publish when they study higher education? And there's a whole list of journals, but these are the top ones, mostly in the South African Journal on Higher Education, and then in Alternation, that is a journal at UKZN, if I'm correct. Yes, I think so. Perspectives in Education, Teaching in Higher Education, that's the only really top-notch international journal with 97 authorships over that 10-year period that we studied. Journal of Psychology, Health Professions. Interestingly enough, colleagues, many people in the health sciences publish on teaching and learning on some aspect of higher education. Acta Academia, Progressio, and then again a medicine one, Family Practice. So those are just the top journals in which most of the publications on higher education are published. Moving on then, 3 slides that I'll share with you on educational research. And I understand education, institutional research here as a subset, as incorporated in the broader set of research on higher education. But as you know, institutional research, quite often it's not published. So it's not in the journals. It is in the form of so-called grey literature. It's in reports to Senate, it's reports to Council. And in fact, the volume of institutional research is much higher than the scholarly research on higher education, and I'll come back to that. So firstly, when we think of institutional research across the world, we have quite a number of associations, professional associations. The oldest one there is the American one, the American Association of Institutional Research, established in 1966. Then there's the European one, EAIR, but although they're quite old, they work mostly on policy. So they have a very different focus. Then there's the Australian one, and then interestingly enough, the Southern African one is one of the older ones, 1994, where this field of profession or this has been organized into an association. And there you see the rest of the list elsewhere in the world, most recently in various Southeast Asian and Asian countries. There's also one in Japan, and so on, and the Middle East. And more recently, across different areas in the world, people still continue to establish such associations. So what do these people do? Typically, institutional research provides information on students, staff, academic programs, facilities, finance, research, engagement, all the things that are going on in the university, the institutional information. Now, just a comment there, the second last bullet. In South African universities, also at UKZN, you have a separate research support office, or the research development office, with a research director. They typically wouldn't call themselves institutional researchers. Research related to the research function is typically placed in a different location. But what they do, in fact, is institutional research, much of what they do when they work with the data and the information and the indicators, citations and outputs, all of that. But then the rest of the university facilities, all of that. And typically, these things are reported in the HEMIS, Higher Education Management Information System, for state subsidy and for the government's purpose, but also for university management. This is just an indication across the world. Typically, institutional researchers gather information on these things. Now, what is institutional research? And again, that's interestingly enough a definition that I got from Victor Borden, in fact. Institutional research is information about the institution for the institution. So it is work done for the sake of the institution, so that the institution can report to the department, or that the institution can report to their own management or the faculty management for decision making and for running the institution. Now, to use for a moment the American example again, they've done a study, Gustlin and many others. What are the typical IR functions at American universities? Now, and this is a study based on, there are literally thousands of IR units across universities in the USA. So they are not only gathering information for decision making. What they do is they identify information needs, then they gather, they analyze, they interpret, they report the data, but they also play a role in the planning and evaluation of all university functions. They are stewards of the data information. They work in the information systems with the IT department. And an important function of IR professionals is to educate the deans and the DVCs and the heads of departments, all of them, and consumers, to understand how university, how the machinery work, what's going on in the machine room of the university. So looking at these functions, the question then comes up, how do the IR functions in South Africa compare with these American ones? And I think there are various similarities, and we've done a number of studies where you can use these categories also. But in South Africa, we have the very specific condition here of working under supporting decision-making, repositioning of universities, transformation, funding, very specific issues. Just think of the Feast Must Fall protests and all of that related to that. And then more recently, COVID. And as you know, there are many, many studies, the impact of COVID, and institutional researchers now have to support various forms of decision-making as part of the response to the restrictions and the pandemic. So the IR functions within those 6 broad categories, 5 broad categories, that it develops all the time and it differs in different contexts. Third subset is on the issue of research, use, and uptake. Now, we've said we see all this research is being done. We've seen all these outputs. Is it used or not? And where and how is it used? Now here I will just show you a number of models. There's a whole course on all these things. And of course, in a few minutes, I can't talk about all of them. So I'll just very broadly show you what is going on in the academic field that focus on research uptake, use, and impact. I use the distinction of Morton here, just as a sort of an overall understanding. Research uptake is when users have engaged with research outputs. That means they've read a policy or they've attending a conference, they're aware of the research. That's a form of uptake. Then moving beyond that, you get research use, when stakeholders acted upon the research. They've either discussed it, they shared it, they forwarded it to somebody else, they used it, adapted it in their context, they wrote a policy, or they took a decision based on the research. That's a deeper form of research use. And then the research impact is when it's possible to pinpoint a demonstrable contribution of the research, typically outside the academic system, in the economy or society or whatever, or changes broadly in awareness or understanding or attitudes. And the impact goes over the longer term. And in evaluation studies, as you know, there are always this distinction between input, outputs, and impact over the longer term. This is a helpful way to understand that there are different levels if we talk about the use of research or the use of science or the impact of science. And in our case, the impact and the use of IR in our universities. So let me show you 3 or 4 of these models. And I actually just want to illustrate a trend here. So the older form, when people started to think about research use, there's some need. Secondly, it's seen as articulated. There's a problem out there. Then we search for solutions. Number 4, we choose a solution. Number 5, we apply it. And then we've solved the problem. Or the original problem is addressed. It's sort of a circular thing, but it's one directional. The one directional one is unpacked in various other models, from basic research, then applied research, then prototypes are developed, then it's produced and packaged, the prototypes, and then activities are based on the available prototypes and products. And then at the end, the user now acts in a particular way, informed by the whole chain from the basic research. But it's all still one directional. And over time, of course, people realize that it's much more complex. And what this illustrates with the arrows in both directions, it's not as if the basic research is done at the beginning, upstream, and then way downstream at the end, you have the consumers. And it's one directional. No, no, no. Throughout the process, it's bi-directional. And it's actually much more complex than this linkage model. So to apply it to higher education, the DVC or the dean sitting in her office asking for information about student performance or research outputs or whatever, it's not just sitting passively there waiting for Rabi and his colleagues and the IR office to produce some information. No, it's an interactive process. The DVC requests some information, but as the IR professionals, you also envision and take initiative to gather and produce information and to push the information into the system. So it's an interactive process. There are various other frameworks. This is just an illustration of how it's more complex. You have that big reservoir of knowledge, and there are various processes with various interactions. And one specific model is the so-called CMP Framework, the social impact assessment methods for research and funding instruments through the study of productive interactions. The crucial word here is productive interactions. Now, in terms of this model, there are all kinds of interactions between the users, say the DVC, and the producers, say the IR professional. There are all kinds of interactions, but it's also interactions between scientists and society in general and policymakers and all of that. In terms of this model, distinction is made between direct interactions, indirect interactions, and financial interactions. And direct interactions is when there was a personal contact between the researchers and the research users. Indirect interactions could be when a research user read a text or looked at a video or studied a scholarly output. So that's indirect through a medium. And then financial interactions is when Carnegie or Kresge or whoever gives funding, and then a lot of research happens, and that creates a whole network of interactions. Now, the important point of this approach by Sparpen and others is that each of these types of interactions can become productive when it leads to efforts by stakeholders to apply the research results to social goals. That is when it induces behavioral change. Again, to apply when managers, vice chancellors, others take a decision, the behavior of the university changed. The admission criteria are adapted based on the research of student success. So these interactions can be those three different forms, and once there is a demonstrable change, then it's seen as a productive interaction. Now, in my final two slides, I'm almost done, colleagues. I will apply this CMP framework to the case study of the three institutions that we studied and interviewed a lot of people in the Eastern Cape, and I want to show you the results of that. What can we do to enhance, to strengthen this uptake? So the research uptake capacity is something that we need to think about systematically, also in the IR office, but also, and I believe there are people listening here today that are working in faculties as academics. If we think about our research, whatever our fields of studies, what can we do as scientists, as scholars, as researchers, and as professionals to enhance the uptake? And there you have, there's a whole model built around that. Create a climate for uptake. So, and how we do that, we enable push factors. We look at the exchange mechanisms, how we interact with our potential users. We enable pull factors, how we interact again with our DVC or VC and help them to think about research needs and information needs and knowledge needs, and then the whole process of monitoring and evaluation. So all these things play a role when we want to strengthen the capacity of our institution and our system to take up, to use our research, and hopefully to see some societal impact. All right, how can we put it all together? Now, I can spend a long time talking about this, but let me just briefly summarize through this graph more or less all that I talked about. So if we look at this big circle here, that's all research done on higher education. And the little blue bubbles are different aspects of research on higher education. That could be research on finance, that could be research on teaching and learning, that could be on the topic of facilities or whatever. That's done typically by scholars who publish. Then a big circle is IR. And what I want to illustrate with that is that the volume of IR outputs is much bigger than the scholarly outputs. The number of reports that IR people put out for management meetings, for council meetings, data analysis, things that they put up on the web, and so on and so on. In terms of volume, that this gray literature is much more than the 2,000 or so scholarly publications that I referred to that in the beginning. But anyway, all of this, whether scholarly or professional, all these outputs, the question that we considered is this interaction with the use of research by stakeholders. And here we have our universities with all their challenges, whether it's COVID, whether it's fees, whatever it is, mergers, ongoing student success issues, and so on and so on. We have the national system and higher education globally. So this is higher education. And we know this orange line here, the sort of proverbial ivory tower issue, that all of higher education is sometimes accused of being separate from society. Because in society, there are problems, poverty, climate, and so on and so on, food security. We have these societal problems. Universities are supposed to do research on these things to help society to solve it. But universities themselves need knowledge to operate better. And for that, they need research on higher education. And the research on higher education is done by the IR professionals, focusing specifically on institutions, and by scholars trying to understand how universities work and all the different dimensions of universities. Now, between these, we hopefully find these productive interactions. Okay, in conclusion then, let's look at the example. If we want to have productive interactions, and we interview people, we find this. Now, I'm not going to go into that in detail. That's just an illustration how you can follow a specific, the sort of the path or the route of a specific output. Say over here, a person in the IR office at a particular university, over here or over there, produced a particular report. That's the network of interactions. That report was funded by somebody. That report is sent to somebody. That other person send it to somebody else. It becomes part of a committee process, and it may end up in some decision that changes practice. So this is how we map it, and there's a whole program and a whole theory behind this, which I cannot go into in detail. But just to show you the kind of detail work that is done in science technology studies to understand when is an interaction between researchers and users, when is it, what does it network look like, and when is it a productive interaction? When does it lead to some form of demonstrable change? And all of this, in the end, I've put it together working sort of inductively. Level 1, I've listed a number of characteristics. What kind of production of interaction tend to be productive? And then I group these into level 2 and in level 3. Level 3 are the preconditions. So let's say your IR office. What preconditions do you have to meet to ensure that the reports that you put out, whether it's your standard reports or your ad hoc reports or whatever advice that you give, what preconditions, how can we group them to lead to specific characteristics, or to meet these characteristics that will ensure or will enhance the opportunity that it will be productive, that it will be used and lead to change. And we can spend a long time talking about this. As I said, we generated this information from interviews with 3 different universities. Firstly, obviously, you have to collaborate with your stakeholders. So the IR office, you have to collaborate within your own institution, but you also have to collaborate outside of your institution. And this collaboration would be, we see number 1 there, with the leaders and managers. So that's the obvious one. You have collaborate in your institution with your DVC or the dean, or you collaborate in your institution with other academics or with other support services. And we have examples of these types of collaborations which led to productive interactions, to the decision making, to changes in behavior, to changes in the institution. But the collaboration, the stakeholder collaboration, can also be outside your own institution. So again, for the research, institutional research office, you may work with academics at other universities or with national bodies, such as the Council on Higher Education, or the Department of Education, or the professional bodies, or whoever, or NGOs. So collaboration, collaboration, collaboration. A second precondition for uptake of your work is the reputation and expertise of the researchers and the practitioners. Your reputation is built on your scholarly and professional reputation as a researcher. Do people know about you? Do they consider your meaning as useful and authoritative and credible? And more specifically, your knowledge and expertise. Do you have an academic record? Do you supervise postgraduate students? That's more on the academic side. But on the practitioner side, your expertise, is it not acknowledged? Are you invited, based on your knowledge and reputation, to serve on task teams in your university or nationally? That's reputation, knowledge, expertise. Then needs-driven research. And we've studied many, many examples of that, where you find 3 types of these. What drives the research? Sometimes it's commission, some national body or some faculty in the university commission you. They call you, Rabi, colleagues, please investigate this and give me the information. Sometimes it can be self-initiated research, and sometimes it can be non-directed outputs. And that's unfortunately one that there's usually not the capacity for, but it's wonderful if the IR office can also take the initiatives to do their own, take on their own topics to address specific needs. Then a condition for uptake is you must have a conducive research and work environment. In the faculty, in the office for research, for institutional research, in the teaching and learning center, the environment should be such that the scholar, the practitioner, can set their own agenda, can bring their research to bear on specific needs. And we have examples of all of these in that institution. A conducive research and work environment. And then obviously, lastly, if you want research to be taken up, there must be research outputs. So you must produce outputs and you must disseminate the outputs. And some scholars, colleagues, have the idea of I do my research, I publish my article, and that's it. I don't care what happens to it. It's not my job to communicate it, to put it out. Sometimes IR people put together a report, work very hard, send the report to council, and then forget about it. No, we want to argue that we need to go beyond that. The dissemination of our research outputs is also part of our work as scholars, as researchers, as professionals. Uh, right, finally, I didn't want to use the session as a kind of a marketing thing, but just in closing then, Rabi referred to that. The research I've just given you a very short glimpse is coming out in this book. It will be available towards the end of August. So here's a draft of the cover by Sun Press. And this is what it looks like. And it will be on the African Media Store. And it is an open access publication. So once the book is out, I can write again to Luiso and Rabi, and you can all download the whole ebook for free. All right, thank you. With that, my presentation is done. Thank you very much, Rabi and Luiso.
Thank you very much, Jan, for that epic journey into the nuances of what I call the scholarship of higher education research, of which institutional research is a subset. So I want to just give a sense of what's going on currently at UKZN, which might inspire some further comments from you, Jan, before I open up the floor for discussion. So curiously, UKZN does not have an institutional research office. We've been trying to establish one for some time, and we've not been successful. That's not to say that institutional research doesn't happen. It happens in various domains. It happens in the institutional intelligence unit, which is a subunit of ICS, which is Information Communication Services. So that unit largely is responsible for extraction and production of data, and less so the analysis of data. Then you have some institutional research being conducted in our QPA, Quality Promotions and Assurance unit, which relates to a large extent to evaluation data. And then you've got my office, which is the Teaching and Learning Office, which does scholarly work on institutional research. So that sort of emphasizes the point you made, and you bemoaned the silo mentality that exists, and indeed it exists at UKZN as well. And some of the members in the chat also expressing their discontent about this silo mentality. However, we will all be reassured or pleased to know that UKZN has acknowledged this fracture. And we are in the midst of what is called Project Renew, which involves the review of all structures, systems, and particularly the synergy between all of these in relation to academics and academic work. And I'm hoping that one of the red flags that emerges from this exercise of Project Renew is the absence of a coordinated, coherent institutional research office. And you know, in support of the Project Renew, as I mentioned earlier, we fortunately received the Kresge Siyaphumelela grant, Siyaphumelela, which stands for We Succeed, and that initiative is being managed by SADI, South African Institute of Distance Education. And we are busy aggressively trying to generate various kinds of, I would say at this stage, quasi-institutional reports, because it doesn't quite satisfy the prescripts of the classification and on your green slide that you have up there. But we're getting there. And so our immediate challenge in the foreseeable future is to build capacity amongst prospective IRs, so that when these structures are launched, we'll have appropriate internal capacity to take up these positions. So I'll pause there, Ian, for any further comments that you might have.
Yeah, thank you, Robbie and colleagues. I've had the privilege now to spend my whole career in higher education, so I've experienced it from the academic side and the support side. And on the one hand, I'm a bit cynical about these things. On the other hand, I remain optimistic. And when it comes to silos, I can only applaud the initiatives that you're taking to look again at your structures and to try to improve synergies and all of that. But a little bit of a cynical side is that I think in the end, it amounts to moving around the deck chairs to some extent. With that, I don't mean that you shouldn't do it. I just have learned from experience that although we continuously grapple with enhancing synergies, once we've reorganized the deck chairs, new silos may crop up. And in my most cynical moments, I have experienced that restructuring, the shelf life of those things are about 3 to 4 years. Then you get a new DVC with new ideas, and then you start all over again. You restructure all over again. So again, my cynicism, I don't want to say don't do that. Of course you should do that. And of course you have done that at UKZN when you've merged. You've done that when you put together executive faculties with executive deans and schools. If you go back 20, 30 years ago, there were no such things. So there has been organization, and it's ongoing. And in the support part of the university, trying to find this synergy between IT, between the Center for Teaching and Learning, with a quality office, with a HEMAS office, with the research office, with the facilities, with the HR, and so on, and so on, and so on. It happens all the time, and we're continuously in that dynamic environment are looking at these things. So yes, I want to applaud what you're doing and fully encourage you to do that. Of course, you should do that. Try to increase the interoperability between your systems. Try to increase the synergy between your units and staff. On the other hand, I think we must also have that realistic expectation that we will not necessarily solve all problems, and things change. With COVID, there are all kinds of new needs now, and people start collaborating in ways that they haven't done before. So we see that quite often when an external event really prompts us to look at our silos and say, no, we can no longer afford that silo to exist. We must address it. And realizing that after 5, 6 years down the line, there may become a new DVC who wants to change it, or there may be new circumstances. And this dynamic field of organizational theory, and within the broader context that I talk about, the dynamic field of knowledge management, I think it's fascinating to work in this field. And you being informed by research, being informed by theoretical reflection, being informed by empirical studies, what I wanted to show a little bit of that to you. I think all these things can help us in this ongoing process, the dynamic process of restructuring, realigning ourselves, and hopefully improving the quality and the impact of everything that we do. But I'm glad to take more questions and comments. Please, colleagues, come in, anyone. I see in the chat, there's a comment by Reina. The key is research collaborations, which is missing in our institution. People tend to use in silos. Reina, I don't know whether you want to comment further on that. It links to what we've discussed so far. So you're welcome to come in, Reina. Or Reina. Okay. Anybody else? Any comments?
So colleagues, please feel free to raise your hands if you have any comments, any contributions. Louisa, will you please keep track of the hands?
I see Ahmed. Yeah, go ahead,
Ahmed's
Ahmed.
hand is up.
Please go ahead, Ahmed.
Are you muted?
I have unmuted him. Ahmed, you may speak. You are unmuted right now.
All right, while Ahmed gets to grips with his thoughts, if you have other comments, can you please raise your hand? Delia North, welcome, Prof. North, and please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Hi, I am Delia North. I'm the Dean and the head of the School of Mathematics, Statistics and Computer Science. And maybe my contribution can just be that the institutional data is very valuable for us as data scientists, because we have, for example, started a recent postgraduate diploma and master's in data science, and we want our students to play with very large data sets, but particularly data sets that they can immediately understand the context of. So I do find that it's a very valuable data source for us, for practicals, or for just to demonstrate on, because if you take industry data, which we often do, you spend a lot of time explaining the context. So every student knows what throughput is. We've recently, with our honors students, looked at the data over the years for throughput. And it really, I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity. We do have PhD students working on some of the institutional research as well. But also, I wanted to ask our guest today about the SAA. I remember many years ago, somebody called Amanda Lawrence was on South African Statistics Association Executive Committee with me. And she would always talk about SAA, and I would tease her and say it sounded like SAA. But at that stage, and I'm going back like 25 years or 20 years, she said, no, this is institutional research. And it was something I'd never heard of. So yeah. I just want to know if the SAA still exists, if you know anything about it. But I know that's sort of something which was about institutional research and was supposed to grow big, but I'm not really in the field. We just play with the data. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Professor North. Thanks, Delia. That was a very excellent and valuable comment. Much appreciated. Before I comment on SAA or SAA, just to welcome enthusiastically what you're saying about using institutional data as examples for your students in data science. That is wonderful. It is an industry, if we say higher education is an industry or a field of practice, that's more or less familiar to students, and the information is available in the institution. And if I may put on the hat for a moment of the director of institutional research that I've been for a long time, I would really welcome such collaboration, where you sit with all the data in your office. You have it, you have your systems, you have all the data, And if you then can collaborate with the academic specialists in your field, in data science and computer science, to interpret and to improve, it's both a learning experience for the student, but it's a wonderful collaboration to help the IR office to improve its data management and to improve its insight into data. I happen to have a family member, a close family member who is a computer scientist, and he always says, don't use the word big data, because the moment you start talking about big data, you illustrate that you don't have a clue what it is. So I'd rather leave it to you, Delia, to use terms like that. As of course, as institutional researchers, we have lots to learn, and to collaborate with the academic specialists, I think that's a very, very exciting development. Then just a comment on SAAIR, Southern African Association of Institutional Research. It's still very strong and going. It's more than 25 years old. It has an annual conference. Membership is mostly people working in the support structures in universities, the data workers or the data managers, not so much IT people, but typically people in the HEMAS kind of environment. And we've tried to involve more academics. At some point, some of them collaborated, sometimes not. People like Amanda, which I know very well, we've collaborated quite a lot. Thijs is working on HIDA, which you use at UKZN also. So that whole field is very lively, and with all the new accountability requirements of universities where we have to report on everything, HIDA is much stronger, and there's quite a significant development around that also all over the world. So if you can encourage your students or colleagues, Delia and others who participate this morning, to present papers at this conference, I can share with you the link. And I think the call for papers has closed for this year, but there's a conference every year. That's another outlet where I can think, ideally, if you have a master's students who've worked on institutional data as part of the study in data science, to present a paper at this conference would be wonderful. So thanks for that, Delia. There's a hand of Ahmed.
Ahmed, are you able to talk to us? So Ahmed seems to have having problems with his sound. I see we have in the audience Professor Jannie Smith. You mentioned, or one of your slides indicated that Alternation was one of the more prolific journals in the country. And I'm pleased to invite Prof. Jannie Smith, who's the editor-in-chief. I'm one of the editors, and he's, overall provided guidance and direction to make Alternation one of the premier journals. Do you want to say hi, Jannie?
Yes, Robbie, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks, Jannie.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Jan. Thank you for your excellent presentation. I think this is very, very helpful. I think it really captures some of the main aspects that we need to look at, as to how we look at the research that we have done, and also try to, on the one hand, analyze the impacts of our research in our communities and on our institutions, obviously, but also our communities. Now, we must just remember that, as you have said, there's always this trap that one rearranges the deck chairs, and there's no real transformation that really grapples with the real issues that you experience in your communities and in your societies. And that is, so I'm very grateful that you also raised this matter of the impact of the universities in our communities and what we need to understand around that, about the impact in our communities. On the one hand, institutionally, teaching and learning, in terms of how we can increase the quality and the capacity of our teaching and learning, of our research-led teaching and learning, and now what we have also learned through the advent of COVID, how to optimize our digital systems and digital tools for purposes of teaching and learning. So these are a number of aspects that I have been thinking about while you were presenting. And maybe finally, I can just say that I really want to thank Ravi for this presentation, and also for the leading role that UTLO has played for about a decade in organizing conferences and also publishing peer-reviewed journal issues in alternation of the best papers that went through the peer review process in alternation. So I think there is really a corpus of material there that could be utilized maybe much better than what we have done up to now. And I think that is maybe a kind of question that all the journals should ask about the impact also in the scholarly domain. And I want to thank Professor Botha also for this point that he made about the fact that academics cannot just say, I've done the research, I've published it, now it's not, whatever happens now is not my responsibility. It is the responsibility of each and every academic to really see, to champion your own research in whatever relevant forum you have, your research is relevant. So I think that is important. So these are aspects of my take of the presentation, and I don't know, Rabi can say maybe a few things more, and Professor Botha. And then I have formulated a question, especially in view of the recent disruptive events that we have witnessed, especially in KZN. And so it basically reflects on the impact of institutions in their communities and in the regions in which they are located. So it looks to me that this could be an area that could be explored. And if there are some transformations that we need that go beyond rearranging the deck chairs, I think we need to look at that. So I've typed it out here in the chat, and I will send it so you can look at that. Maybe not to fully answer now, but something for us to reflect on. But thank you very much for this presentation. I don't know, Rabi, Jan, if you want to respond.
No, thank you, Yanni. I can just agree and welcome your insights. I see you want to, the name of alternation is specifically interdisciplinary journal. Are you also working beyond the humanities or to the natural sciences, Yanni?
Jan, we do publish on education. And I must thank all our education professors who are playing a leading role in this area. But up to now, we have only published from the natural sciences that was channeled through the education, School of Education. So directly, we have not engaged the potential to publish on interdisciplinary work with the natural sciences. I know that there are quite a number of possibilities between the humanities and the natural sciences, and I know that Stellenbosch had made some big advances in this area, also in terms of the degrees that they offer that I have heard of and that I know of. So I know that there are quite a number of possibilities that could be explored here. But if you want to say something more about it, you're welcome.
No, if I may, Ravi, I just want to comment on what you've written there, Yanni, in the chat. I are focusing contextual issues, thinking of the disruptions in our country recently. If you think about the history of higher education, there are always this linkages between events inside and outside institutions impacting on what we're doing in our research and with students. If we just go back, we now at the forefront of our minds are these issues of the last 2 or 3 weeks. But since last year, at the forefront of our minds have been and still are the issues related to the pandemic. 3 or 4 years ago, it was funding, financing, free higher education, student protests. 10 years before that, it was mergers. 10 years before that, it was the dawn of the democratic dispensation in the country, and so on. So we can go back, and I have an interest in higher education, go back right through all the ages to the Middle Ages to see we have this symbiotic relationship between universities. In a sense, universities reflect what's going on outside in the world. On the other hand, the outside world deeply impacts on what we do in universities. So I can only agree and applaud with that, pointing out that and emphasizing that, Yanni, that institutional researchers, I always encourage colleagues in this field, try to think beyond just the immediate data set that you're dealing with now and the technicalities of the data set, but try to think about the context holistically, and how you can also take initiatives to help your potential users in the institution and beyond to understand universities, to understand what's going on in universities, and also to understand how we can change to address and respond better to the world around us. So thank you, Yanni, for that. I
Prof,
see, yes?
there are a few questions in the chat.
Yeah.
2 of them from Ahmed. What are the requirements to be a specialist in institutional research? The second one is, do institutional research specialists need to be software experts?
Yeah, Ahmed, thanks for that.
Sorry,
yeah,
before you take those, before you take those questions, perhaps and as an add-on to your comment to Yanni Smith, it is quite apparent that there is a shift now in higher education and a call for applied research as opposed to the abundance of pure research. And I think Yanni is sort of hinting here that we also need to shift our focus, particularly since the world is characterized by mounting crises, and we can't remain disconnected from these crises, that the university is in fact a microcosm of the world, and we need to be more in tune. So Yanni, this might be an opportunity to put out a call for another special issue.
Yes, that would be excellent. Yes, Robbie.
Sorry, back to the chat, Louisa.
Okay, it's a question of Ahmed there on the software experts. Thanks, Ahmed. Yes, obviously, you can't understand data, you can't work with data, and Delia will also explain that much better than I can do, if you don't have that expertise. And whether they should be in the IR office or whether they should be in the IT department, that I think depends on institutional context. I know, talking of silos, I know from work with across universities across the country and elsewhere in the world that between the IT people and the IR people, sometimes it's quite tricky. At Pretoria University, at some point, they had a whole team of software people, coders, in the IR department. And then the IT department balked and they moved them to IT. And then IT started developing all kinds of software solutions and customizations, which the IR people said, no, 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 we can't use it. And you're messing up with all our systems and our data structures and so on. So it's been an ongoing debate. But my sense, and I work a lot with IT people, is that there's a growing understanding that IT is not simply just plugging in the computers and running the software systems. It's also strategic. It's also interpreting the context, and it's also understanding the nature of the information. And these things the people in data science think about all the time. So it calls again for collaboration. And in that collaboration, we should have our specialization. So yes, if possible, in terms of your institutional model, your IR office can have 1, 2, or 3 coders, coding software specialists. It would be wonderful. I'm sure Ravi and his colleagues will welcome that. On the other hand, if they are not located within the IR unit or similar unit, but they are located in IT, as long as their job description is clear and they're kind of dedicated to focus on institutional data and the optimal use of institutional data, that's also perfectly fine. The IR people tend to be more the information specialists. They understand the information, the EMIS information, the structure of the information, but they not always have the capabilities. In fact, rarely have the capabilities of coding, of really designing systems and customizing systems when it comes to the real hard, or not hard, but the real technical software issues. So it depends a little bit on the what is needed in the institution. So that's Ahmed's question. Then there's Setu. Are there any evident effects of digital transformation in higher education on the organization, IT, and within? Yes, Setu, thanks. Brilliant question. If you now go to university websites, almost everywhere, you will find on the website a total different world in terms of institutional information than what was there before. It's very strongly digital, it's digitally available. People put up dashboards, people manipulate and report their institutional information in terms of the best and the newest digital possibilities and software. So yes, we see the effects, not only in the reporting and the communication, but also in the operations, in deeper in the systems itself. In fact, I think that the broader digital transformation in the world, you cannot imagine doing institutional research and running an institution and not having that. In later vein, Setu, I can tell you, and the people have retired, so if I say something that step on toes, forgive me. But in our registration, or our registrar's office here at Stellenbosch, 10, 15 years ago, I had an ongoing debate with them because they were very reluctant to move into the digital world. They still had typists. Can you believe that? They employed typists, and some of them wrote the stuff with their hand. So all of that has changed. So the answer is yes. I think In fact, it's not only that the digital transformation has arrived in IR. I think in many contexts, the IR people are the pioneers, doing wonderful new things with the state-of-the-art new applications. Okay, then I think.
Can I interrupt you, Jan?
Yep.
Before participants start dialing out, we have reached the end.
I see we've ended time.
Yeah, I want to make two announcements. The first relates to our IR capacity building initiative, which I indicated was interrupted. We are resurrecting it in 2021. So look out for an announcement. And who knows, you might see Jan teaching on the program if we can persuade and bend his arm. Victor Borden will once again be part of that team. The second announcement relates to institutional research grants. Look out for an announcement that will be released around October, I think. Loiso will send that announcement to this group, which provides opportunities for teams, interdisciplinary teams, to conduct research. And we must emphasize here, this is going to be applied research on real university problems, including the problems that Yanni Smith alluded to about our responsiveness to the broader society. So with those words, once again, yeah, thank you. Your presentation was beautifully lucid and clear without jargon. And I think our schemas are now all enhanced after your presentation. And we look forward to working with you in the future.
Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, Luiso. Yeah, Ravi, I appreciate the invitation. Thank you, colleagues. Thanks.